The winter cold settled over the Kremlin on a bleak January evening in 1953 as Joseph Stalin sat alone in his dacha at Kontsevo, surrounded by reports that documented not military defeat like Hitler had faced, but something potentially more insidious: the gradual unraveling of the Soviet system he had built through decades of terror, the emergence of challenges to Soviet dominance that Stalin's methods could not overcome, and the growing recognition among those closest to Stalin that the aging dictator's increasingly erratic behavior and paranoid purges were threatening the stability of the entire Soviet state. Stalin's final years from roughly 1949 until his death in March 1953 were characterized by escalating paranoia, deteriorating health, strategic setbacks that contradicted Stalin's vision of inevitable Soviet triumph, and the development of plans for massive new purges that suggested Stalin had concluded that internal enemies rather than external realities explained why Soviet power was not expanding as rapidly as Stalin believed it should. Stalin's understanding of power had always been rooted in the belief that ruthless application of force, systematic elimination of potential rivals, and maintenance of absolute personal control could overcome any obstacle, whether domestic opposition, agricultural shortages, industrial limitations, or international resistance to Soviet expansion. This approach had allowed Stalin to consolidate power in the 1920s by eliminating rivals like Trotsky, Bukharin, and Zinoviev, to force industrialization and agricultural collectivization in the 1930s despite catastrophic human costs that killed millions through famine and execution, to survive the Nazi invasion through willingness to sacrifice soldiers and civilians on scales that would have broken other leaders, and to emerge from World War II with Soviet power extending across Eastern Europe, and Soviet influence reaching into Asia, the Middle East, and parts of the developing world. Stalin's methods had been brutal beyond measure, but from Stalin's perspective, they had worked, transforming backward Russia into a superpower that rivaled the United States and that appeared poised for eventual global dominance. The immediate post-war years from 1945 to 1949 had seen remarkable expansion of Soviet power and influence that seemed to validate Stalin's strategic vision. Soviet forces occupied Eastern Europe and Stalin had systematically transformed Poland, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, and East Germany into satellite states controlled by communist parties that took orders from Moscow. The Soviet Union had acquired atomic weapons far more quickly than American intelligence had predicted, detonating its first atomic bomb in August 1949 and eliminating the American nuclear monopoly that some Western strategists had hoped would contain Soviet expansion. Communist forces under Mao Zedong had won the Chinese Civil War in 1949, creating a communist China that appeared to be a natural Soviet ally and that extended communist control over the world's most populous nation. Communist parties in France and Italy commanded significant electoral support and seemed positioned to potentially take power through democratic means. Soviet-backed communist forces were fighting in Greece, Malaya, and the Philippines. The global correlation of forces, in Marxist terminology that Stalin used, appeared to be shifting in favor of socialism. But beneath these apparent successes, developments were emerging that challenged Stalin's assumptions about how power operated and about how the post-war order would evolve. The Marshall Plan, announced by the United States in 1947 and implemented beginning in 1948, was rebuilding Western European economies with American aid on scales that were creating prosperity and political stability that made Western European populations increasingly resistant to communist appeals. Stalin had forced Eastern European countries to reject Marshall Plan aid, insisting that accepting American economic assistance would compromise Soviet control, but this decision meant that while Western Europe was experiencing rapid economic recovery, Soviet-controlled Eastern Europe remained impoverished, repressed, and economically stagnant. The contrast between Western prosperity and Eastern poverty was becoming visible and was undermining the ideological claim that socialism represented a superior economic system. The Berlin blockade from June 1948 to May 1949, Stalin's attempt to force Western powers out of Berlin by cutting off ground access to the city, had failed when the United States and Britain organized an airlift that supplied West Berlin for nearly a year until Stalin abandoned the blockade without achieving his objectives. The Berlin airlift demonstrated Western determination to resist Soviet pressure, showcased American logistical capabilities that could sustain operations that Stalin had assumed were impossible, and resulted in political outcome opposite to what Stalin intended. Rather than forcing Western powers out of Berlin, the crisis led to creation of NATO in April 1949, formalizing a Western military alliance specifically designed to contain Soviet expansion. The formation of NATO represented strategic defeat for Stalin because it meant that the United States was committing to permanent military presence in Europe, that Western European countries were coordinating defense policies to resist Soviet pressure, and that Soviet expansion in Europe had reached limits that Stalin's methods could not overcome without risking general war. The Tito-Stalin split in 1948, when Yugoslav leader Josip Broz Tito refused to subordinate Yugoslav policy to Soviet direction and Stalin proved unable to overthrow or force Tito's compliance, represented an ideological and strategic challenge that contradicted fundamental premises of Stalin's understanding of communist movement. Stalin had assumed that all communist parties would naturally accept Soviet leadership, that personal loyalty to Stalin was synonymous with communist commitment, and that any communist leader who defied Moscow could be destroyed through the same methods of intimidation, subversion, and purges that Stalin used domestically. Tito's successful resistance to Soviet pressure, Yugoslavia's survival despite economic blockade and threats of invasion, and Tito's development of independent foreign policy demonstrated that communism did not automatically mean Soviet control and that Stalin's authority did not extend beyond reach of Soviet military power. Stalin's response to the Tito affair was escalating paranoia about potential Titoism in other Eastern European countries, leading to massive purges throughout the Soviet bloc in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Show trials in Hungary, Bulgaria, Poland, and Czechoslovakia resulted in execution or imprisonment of communist leaders suspected of insufficient loyalty to Moscow, with charges of Titoist deviation, nationalism, and bourgeois tendencies being applied to veteran communists who had spent their lives serving the movement. The Slansky trial in Czechoslovakia in 1952, which resulted in execution of Rudolf Slansky and 13 other defendants, most of them Jewish, revealed Stalin's growing obsession with alleged conspiracies and his increasing tendency to blame setbacks on sabotage rather than on policy failures. The purges created terror throughout Eastern European communist parties but also generated resentment, demonstrated that loyalty to Moscow meant nothing if Stalin suspected disloyalty, and established that Stalin's paranoia made everyone potentially vulnerable regardless of service or dedication. The Korean War, which began in June 1950 when North Korean forces invaded South Korea with Stalin's approval and support, appeared initially to offer opportunities for extending communist power in Asia and for testing American resolve. Stalin had authorized Kim Il-sung's invasion plan, provided military equipment and advisors, and arranged for Chinese intervention if necessary, while calculating that the United States would not risk general war over Korea and that Soviet forces would not need to intervene directly. The war's first months seemed to validate Stalin's calculations, with North Korean forces rapidly overrunning most of South Korea and pushing American and South Korean forces back to a defensive perimeter around Pusan. But the American response, rather than accepting North Korean victory, involved massive military commitment including amphibious landing at Incheon in September 1950 that cut North Korean supply lines and turned the war's momentum dramatically. The Chinese intervention in Korea in October 1950, when hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops crossed into Korea and drove American forces back from the Chinese border, prevented North Korean defeat but led to military stalemate that continued for nearly 3 years of grinding warfare without decisive results. The Korean War from Stalin's perspective became increasingly problematic as it continued through 1951 and 1952. The war was consuming Chinese resources and lives with over 1 million Chinese casualties, was demonstrating that American forces would fight communist expansion rather than accepting it passively, was solidifying American military presence in Asia, was leading to American rearmament on scales that increased Western military capabilities, and was settling into stalemate that achieved none of the strategic objectives that had made supporting North Korean invasion appear attractive. Stalin had wanted to expand communist control without Soviet casualties and without provoking general war, but the Korean War was generating enormous Chinese casualties, was creating permanent American military commitment to South Korea, and was increasing Cold War tensions in ways that strengthened rather than weakened Western resolve. The development of the hydrogen bomb by the United States, with the first thermonuclear device tested in November 1952, represented qualitative advance in destructive power that Soviet atomic weapons could not match and that created temporary American advantage in nuclear arms race. Stalin had insisted that Soviet scientists develop hydrogen weapons immediately, but Soviet thermonuclear program was trailing American progress, and the gap created anxiety in Stalin's mind about American nuclear superiority and about whether Soviet deterrent remained credible. The nuclear competition was consuming enormous resources, was creating existential threats that neither superpower could eliminate through offensive action without risking mutual destruction, and was establishing strategic realities that Stalin's traditional methods of intimidation and subversion could not overcome. The failure of communist parties in Western Europe to achieve power despite Stalin's expectations was revealing that revolutionary conditions that Stalin had predicted would emerge from post-war chaos were not materializing. The French and Italian communist parties, despite strong electoral showings immediately after the war, were losing support as Marshall Plan aid revived economies and as Western governments implemented social programs that addressed working-class grievances without revolutionary upheaval. Stalin had expected that capitalist crisis would create revolutionary opportunities, that Western European workers would become radicalized by unemployment and poverty, and that communist parties would ride waves of discontent to power. Instead, Western Europe was achieving prosperity, democratic institutions were proving resilient, and communist parties were being marginalized rather than gaining strength. The economic situation within the Soviet Union by the early 1950s was presenting challenges that Stalin's methods could not solve. Soviet living standards remained far below Western levels despite 3 decades of communist rule, agricultural production was chronically insufficient requiring periodic grain imports, consumer goods were scarce and of poor quality, housing shortages meant multiple families sharing single apartments, and the command economy system was generating inefficiencies and distortions that were becoming increasingly evident. Stalin's response to economic difficulties was to demand greater efforts from Soviet workers, to blame shortcomings on sabotage and wrecking, and to maintain investment priorities that favored heavy industry and military production over consumer welfare. But this approach was generating diminishing returns, and the gap between Soviet living standards and Western prosperity was widening rather than narrowing. The Doctor's Plot, announced in January 1953, represented Stalin's return to mass terror on scales reminiscent of the 1930s purges and suggested Stalin's conclusion that internal enemies explained why Soviet progress was not matching Stalin's expectations. The accusation that prominent Soviet doctors, most of them Jewish, were plotting to murder Soviet leaders through medical mistreatment was transparently false but was being used to justify preparations for massive new purges. The Doctor's Plot followed a pattern established decades earlier where Stalin identified supposed conspiracies, arrested prominent individuals who confessed under torture to fantastic charges, and used these confessions to justify eliminating thousands or millions of people identified as potential enemies. The target this time appeared to be Soviet Jews, who Stalin suspected of insufficient loyalty due to their potential connections to Israel and to the West. But the purge was planned to extend far beyond Jewish doctors to include party officials, military officers, industrial managers, and anyone Stalin suspected of potential disloyalty. The anti-Semitic campaign that accompanied the Doctor's Plot revealed Stalin's deteriorating judgment and his increasing tendency to view international developments through conspiratorial lens. The establishment of Israel in 1948 had initially received Soviet support, as Stalin calculated that Israel might become a socialist state and that weakening British influence in the Middle East served Soviet interests. But Israel had aligned with the West rather than with the Soviet Union, and Stalin had concluded that Soviet Jews represented a potential fifth column whose loyalty to the Soviet Union was questionable. The anti-Semitic campaign, barely disguised as anti-Zionism, included purging Jews from positions of influence, closing Jewish cultural institutions, and preparing for deportations to remote regions that would have paralleled Stalin's earlier deportations of Chechens, Crimean Tatars, and other nationalities accused of collective disloyalty. Lavrentiy Beria, head of the Soviet secret police and one of Stalin's most powerful subordinates, later testified after Stalin's death that Stalin had been planning purges that would have eliminated significant portions of Soviet leadership and that would have extended terror to levels comparable to the 1930s. Beria claimed that lists were being prepared of officials to be arrested, that accusations were being fabricated, that interrogation facilities were being readied, and that Stalin's death prevented implementation of purges that would have convulsed Soviet society. Beria's testimony must be treated cautiously given that Beria had motives to portray himself as having opposed Stalin's worst intentions, but other evidence including the Doctor's Plot prosecutions and the arrests of officials accused of involvement in supposed conspiracies suggest that major purges were indeed being prepared. Stalin's physical and mental deterioration in his final years contributed to increasingly erratic decision-making and to paranoia that saw enemies everywhere. Stalin, who would be 73 years old when he died in March 1953, was suffering from arteriosclerosis that affected his cognitive function, was experiencing periods of confusion and memory loss, was displaying heightened suspicion of even long-time associates, and was making decisions that subordinates recognized as irrational but that no one dared challenge. The system Stalin had created made him accountable to no one, allowed him to order arrests or executions on whim, and ensured that even Stalin's closest associates lived in constant fear that they might be accused of treason or sabotage on the basis of Stalin's latest suspicions. The meetings at Stalin's dacha in the months before his death were characterized by forced conviviality where Stalin's subordinates including Beria, Nikita Khrushchev, Georgy Malenkov, and Vyacheslav Molotov attended lengthy dinners that extended into early morning hours, watched films selected by Stalin, engaged in conversations that Stalin dominated, and participated in rituals that everyone understood were tests of loyalty where any perceived slight or failure to show proper enthusiasm could have fatal consequences. Khrushchev later described these gatherings as ordeals where attendees never knew whether they would return home or be arrested, where Stalin made cryptic comments that seemed to hint at suspicions about individuals' loyalty, and where the aging dictator displayed cruelty and capriciousness that kept everyone off balance. Stalin's isolation from reality was reinforced by the system he had created where information reaching Stalin was filtered to remove bad news, where subordinates competed to tell Stalin what he wanted to hear rather than providing accurate assessments, and where anyone who challenged Stalin's assumptions risked being labeled defeatist or disloyal. The result was that Stalin received a distorted picture of both Soviet domestic conditions and international situation, believed that Soviet power was greater than it actually was, assumed that Western strength was weaker than reality, and made decisions based on assessments that had limited connection to actual circumstances. This information problem was inherent in totalitarian systems where leaders punish bearers of bad news, but it became acute in Stalin's final years when his deteriorating health made him even more suspicious and unpredictable. The reaction to Stalin's death on March 5, 1953, revealed the complexity of feelings that Stalin inspired. Official propaganda portrayed Stalin's death as devastating loss and described spontaneous grief among Soviet population. But behind the propaganda there was also enormous relief among officials who had lived in terror, among prisoners in labor camps who hoped for amnesties, and among ordinary citizens who feared that new purges would destroy their lives. The trampling deaths at Stalin's funeral, where hundreds of people were crushed in crowds trying to view Stalin's body, represented both the population's conditioned response to show proper respect for the dead leader and the consequences of security measures that created dangerous bottlenecks in crowds. The immediate aftermath of Stalin's death saw his closest subordinates moving quickly to dismantle the most dangerous elements of Stalin's late plans. The doctor's plot was announced to have been fabricated, the arrested doctors were released, and officials responsible for the case were blamed for creating false accusations. The broader purges that Stalin had been planning were quietly abandoned, with lists of intended victims being destroyed and preparations for mass arrests being halted. Beria, in a bid for power and perhaps genuinely recognizing that Stalinist terror was unsustainable, authorized release of hundreds of thousands of prisoners from labor camps and announced reforms that would have reduced secret police power. These actions, occurring within weeks of Stalin's death, indicated that even Stalin's closest subordinates recognized that Stalin's late policies were leading toward catastrophe and that changes were necessary to prevent system collapse. The power struggle that followed Stalin's death, culminating in Beria's arrest in June 1953 and eventual execution in December, revealed that even those who had served Stalin most faithfully recognized that continuing Stalin's methods unchanged would threaten Soviet stability. Khrushchev, who would emerge as Soviet leader and who would deliver the secret speech in 1956 denouncing Stalin's crimes, had been complicit in Stalin's purges and had participated in the system that made Stalin's terror possible. But even Khrushchev recognized that Stalinist system as it existed in 1953 was unsustainable, that reforms were necessary to prevent economic stagnation and political crisis, and that Stalin's late paranoia had been leading toward purges that would have threatened everyone regardless of service or loyalty. Stalin's strategic vision in his final years was characterized by growing disconnect between Stalin's expectations of inevitable communist expansion and the reality that Soviet power had reached limits that terror and ideology could not overcome. Stalin had expected that capitalist contradictions would create revolutionary opportunities, that Western European workers would embrace communism, that colonial empires would collapse and create openings for Soviet influence, that China's communist revolution would extend Soviet power across Asia, and that American capitalism would eventually enter crisis that would shift global power balance decisively towards socialism. Some of these expectations were being realized. China had gone communist, colonial empires were indeed beginning to dissolve, and the Soviet Union had become a superpower. But the pace and nature of change were not matching Stalin's vision. Western capitalism was proving resilient rather than crisis-prone, Western Europe was prospering rather than radicalizing, NATO was containing Soviet expansion, and the United States was demonstrating economic and military capabilities that exceeded Soviet capacity to match. Stalin's realization that Soviet progress was not matching his expectations, to the extent Stalin ever fully acknowledged this rather than blaming setbacks on sabotage and insufficient vigilance, appears to have manifested not as strategic reconsideration but as intensified paranoia and renewed terror. Stalin's response to disappointment was not to question whether his assumptions might be wrong but to conclude that internal enemies were preventing achievement of goals that otherwise would be inevitable. This pattern had characterized Stalin's rule from the beginning. When agricultural collectivization created famine, Stalin blamed kulaks and saboteurs rather than acknowledging policy failures. When industrial production fell short of planned targets, Stalin blamed wreckers rather than unrealistic planning. When Hitler invaded in 1941 despite Stalin's efforts to appease Germany, Stalin blamed intelligence failures and traitors rather than his own strategic errors. The final years followed the same pattern. When Soviet expansion met resistance and Soviet plans encountered obstacles, Stalin blamed conspiracies and prepared purges rather than considering that his methods might be reaching their limits. The collapse of Stalin's plans, unlike Hitler's catastrophic military defeat, was not dramatic battlefield disaster but rather the gradual revelation that Stalin's methods could not overcome certain realities, that terror could compel obedience but could not generate genuine loyalty or creativity, that command economics could mobilize resources for narrow priorities but could not produce broad prosperity, that communist ideology could inspire committed believers but could not transform human nature, that Soviet power could control territory occupied by Red Army but could not extend indefinitely beyond reach of Soviet military force, and that the United States and Western Europe possessed economic strength and political resilience that Stalin's predictions of capitalist collapse had failed to account for. Stalin died before these limitations became undeniable, and Stalin's successors would spend decades trying to overcome contradictions inherent in the system Stalin created. When Stalin died in March 1953, he died believing or at least publicly maintaining that history was on socialism's side, that Soviet power would eventually triumph over capitalism, that internal enemies rather than systemic problems explain difficulties, and that continued vigilance and renewed purges would restore revolutionary momentum. The reality that Stalin's methods had created a system that was economically inefficient, politically repressive, internationally contained, and fundamentally unsustainable became fully evident only in the decades after Stalin's death, culminating in Soviet Union's collapse in 1991. But the signs were visible in Stalin's final years, in the need for perpetual terror to maintain control, in the gap between propaganda and reality, in the satellite states that required Soviet tanks to prevent rebellion, in the arms race that consumed resources without providing security, and in the isolation from reality that totalitarian power created. Stalin's final years represented not sudden catastrophic failure like Hitler experienced but rather the beginning of long decline that Stalin's terror could delay but could not prevent, and that would eventually demonstrate that the communist system Stalin built could not fulfill the promises that sustained it.